Good morning, everybody. Welcome here to our Stand ICT webinar, which is today focused on Asia. And I'm very happy that we have here two speakers from the Humboldt University, Sarah Eaton. She's professor of Translational China Studies. And her colleague Daniel Fuchs, assistant professor at the Institute for Asian and African Studies, also at the Humboldt University, and I'm quite happy that they entered the field of standardization in the last few years, and they will also go a little bit into more details about the interesting and prestigious projects they are running in this context, especially also comparing China, other Asian countries with what's going on in Europe. And that's quite a unique situation of having kind of such a comparative database to especially also now with the focus on ICT, which is the main focus of the projects in ICT. And that's really quite interesting what they are going to present. I will have no slides, and I'm also welcome Suli Zhang from the China Chilean University. She's their professor working on standardization, but also on intellectual property rights. We also did some common work on these topics. Who will kind of present a little bit the Chinese view on what Sarah and Daniel are going to present. And we have a fourth speaker, Professor Lee from Korea, the Graduate School of International Study at the Honsei University. He's not yet with us, but since I think there are very interesting topics and results to share, and we might also have a first discussion after Suli's kind of comments. I give you now, Sarah and Daniel, the floor to present your very interesting findings. And those participants who are interested to ask questions, you can use the Q&A option, or you might also be able to use the chat and ask your questions. Depending on how many we are at the end, we might even give you the direct option to intervene. But let's see. Now, Sarah, Daniel, up to you.
Great. I will share my slides here. Can everyone see? Fantastic. First off, thank you so much to Knut for this invitation to present our findings to this great network. We're a big fan, and also a personal thanks to Knut and his team for being such great supporters of our entry into this field of standardization research. Knut has been extremely generous in helping us in all kinds of ways, and we're really grateful for that. Okay, so let me just try to set the stage here with how it is, what's the story behind two researchers in the field of trans-regional China studies? How do they end up becoming fascinated in the world of standardization? That's a story unto itself. Daniel and I both have backgrounds in China studies, as well as in political science. And since about 2019, we've been researching together quite intensively on the topic of, in particular, China's changing role in the world of standardization. We did this first through a project funded by the German Research Foundation, which compares China and Korea's pathways in sort of late coming into the world of international standard setting for digital standards. A second thank you to Heejin Lee, who is not yet here, who was our very generous and helpful partner in the South Korean side of the research for the German Research Foundation project. So again, here our interest is really in trying to understand how it is that these two latecomer countries have been so successful in developing influence in international standard setting. So looking also not only, of course, at the technology implications of that, but also at the institutional side of things. So how have, for example, domestic reforms of China's standardization system contributed to rising influence at the international level? In a more recent project funded by the European Research Council that got going in 2024 and will run till 2029, we're looking at a similar set of questions, sort of the dynamics of late coming in standardization governance, but with a broader range of countries. So here we're looking at China, but also at India and Kenya. Yeah, and this project is called Tectonics. If you're interested in joining us or finding out more about what it is we're up to, we're very, very interested in making connections both with other researchers like us interested in the topic of late coming in standardization, as well as practitioners in the field. Please check out our website. You can also send us an email. We have our kickoff workshop somewhat belatedly in June of this year. Yeah, and we're very, very interested in connecting with people. Okay, so both for the German Research Foundation project and for this ERC, European Research Council project, we're big believers in so-called mixed methods. So this is the view that in order to study a complicated topic like standardization governance well, one needs to combine various research methods. And here we're talking about combining both quantitative and qualitative research methods. So for this German Research Foundation project, we ran a multinational survey on standardization governance in 6 countries, and we're presenting some of the highlights of that survey for you today. For the ERC project, we are planning a follow-up survey to run in late 2026. And we also are developing a database on standardization participation in different SDOs. So with these quantitative data sources, one can do statistical analysis, and that provides all kinds of insights. And we also believe in the value of qualitative research, talking to people, observing how standardization actually works in better understanding standardization governance. So here and this is principally Daniel Fuchs here, have conducted a total of 113 interviews with standardization experts in Europe and Asia, principally in China and South Korea, and have also conducted participant observation in technical committee meetings and in standardization summits. So we're trying to learn as much as we can about the topic as kind of outsiders using these various different research approaches. Now to the DFG survey. So the topics of this particular survey were broadly about current developments in ICT standardization at the international level. So in particular, given our focus on China and China's changing role in this field, we were interested in the role of China in how geopolitics may or may not be changing sort of established ways of doing things in standardization governance, as well as respondents' perceptions of the relative performance of different international standard development organizations. So who did we talk to? Our target respondents were standardization experts at firms in ICT in China, South Korea, France, Germany, the US, and the UK. And we had questionnaire versions in all of these languages. The survey was administered through the online survey provider Qualtrics at the end of 2024 and the beginning of March 2025. We don't have time to go into the details of how the survey was administered. We're happy to answer questions about that at the end. But we had various quotas that we worked with Qualtrics on fulfilling. So we had country quotas. We aimed to achieve 200 responses in each of our 6 countries, except for South Korea, where we had to reduce the number to 100 because the size of the ICT sector was simply not large enough to allow for 200 respondents. We were interested in contacting firms who were themselves active in the shaping of standardization processes. So this meant that we, by default, were talking with large companies. For most of the vast majority of respondents in our sample are companies who have a minimum of 250 employees. So that's important to keep in mind, that we're focusing on a particular segment of ICT. The limitations of only surveying in 6 countries, yes, of course. It's not, of course, a lot when one looks at how international technical committees have become. We would argue that these 6 countries are, however, particularly important because they hold leading roles in SDOs. So here we're looking at the percentage or the proportion of ISO, TCs, and SC secretariats held by these countries together. That comes to 63%. And in IEC, they hold about 58% of all secretariats. So these are big heavyweight players in the world of standardization. It would have been nice to do a broader sample, but we're limited by resources. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be digging into various aspects of interesting cross-national variation that we uncovered in the survey. Question 1 that we will get into is the question of, what do firms invest in standardization? So in particular, how much emphasis is given to standardization within ICT firms in these different countries in terms of, 1, personnel and staffing. So within sort of the governance of the corporation, what standing does standardization have? And 2, how much investment do we see in training? Second, what role does the state play in standardization? As we know, standardization in many countries in Europe, in the United States, is led by the private sector. In some latecomer standardization countries, China, Korea, as well as India, technical standard setting, the state plays a much bigger role. So here we are interested in teasing these cross-national differences out a little bit more concretely. So what are the particular measures of the state role in terms of, for example, financial support? And then a third set of questions goes into the question of how latecomers, and here we're focusing on China, are really perceived by other countries, by experts from other countries in our sample. So in the context here is that, as we know, we live, unfortunately, in a world of rising tech conflict between the US and China. And some observers, particularly in the Western media and think tanks, have suggested that China is in some way, or the arrival of Chinese experts in a big way at international SDOs, pose some kind of threat to standardization governance. And so we were interested in going to the experts themselves who actually sit in these TCs to figure out to what extent this perception is also held by people kind of working really in the field. And then following on for this question of China threat perception, if you will, we were also interested in finding out how it is that these experts perceive what are their preferences for how standardization governance should be conducted. So for example, should we continue with the route of international cooperation and keep doors open to all countries, including China? Or do firms think about developing standards for emerging technologies in groupings of so-called like-minded countries, such as the Trade and Technology Council initiative under the Biden administration? Now, no longer alive under Trump 2.0, but this idea of perhaps developing standards together with like-minded countries for technologies like AI is very much an idea that's alive. So how is it that experts within these firms actually view these various kinds of scenarios? Okay, topic 1, firm investments in standardization. Again, we combine mixed methods in our research, and we've learned a lot from talking to people in the field. From our own interviews with standardization experts, we have learned that there is a perception that Chinese firms in international STOs are investing much more in standardization than their counterparts, particularly in European countries. So one European ICT firm representative told us recently in March that Chinese company X, when it came to developing international standards, had more resources, more time, and more manpower. Another interviewee pointed out that the situation was vastly different within their own European firm. I like to say that if I only want to send 1/4 of a person to a standardization meeting, I need to put together an internal business case, justify it, and so forth. If China wants to send 20 people, they send 20 people. So we wanted to dig into this question of whether it's true, in fact, that Chinese firms are investing much more in standardization. We have two measures here, one on training. So does your company carry out standardization training workshops for employees on a regular basis? And the second measure is on whether your company currently maintains a standardization department. So our expectations here, or our hypotheses, are that Chinese companies would be training more than other countries, and that they're more likely to have a standardization department. What does the data tell us? Well, our first hypothesis is not confirmed, interestingly, within the data. What we find is that while Chinese firms, a vast majority of Chinese firms, 3/4 of them, do offer regular standardization training, they still lag behind the kind of established standards powers in the field. Germany, US, and UK, the firms in our sample here appear to be offering standardization training more regularly than their counterparts in China. So that's an interesting finding that suggests that in the domain of standardization knowledge and knowledge sharing, Western ICT firms are still in the lead to a degree. Our hypothesis number 2, that Chinese firms would be more likely to have a standardization department, was strongly confirmed within our data. Here we're looking at the distribution of firms in the medium-sized category, in the large category, and in the very large category. So we see that in the large and very large categories, literally almost all firms have standardization departments, and even in the medium firms as well. The vast majority do as well. How does this compare internationally? Here, the differences were striking. The differences are statistically significant, and the effect sizes here are quite large. So we see, again, that in China, 97% of the firms in our sample have a standardization department, and this is vastly different than the other countries in our sample. Now, a note about South Korea. I see Heejin is not yet here, but he would point this out certainly. As we said, in South Korea, we only have 100 respondents in comparison to 200 for all the other countries, and that reflects the fact that the ICT sector in Korea is somewhat smaller compared to these other countries, and also the average size of the firms in South Korea that we surveyed are somewhat smaller than the other firms. So this South Korea result should be taken with a little grain of salt. Now, nonetheless, our key finding that Chinese firms are outliers here seems to be confirmed. Okay, topic 2, state involvement in standardization. In our interviews, we've also heard that there is a perception that the state plays a critical role in China's success as a latecomer in ICT standardization. A German SDO representative told us China has made it a strategic goal to be active in standardization. This is because they have recognized that if you want to be at the forefront of a technology, you also have to set standards. Another European standardization expert told us a lot of European and also American companies complain to their government that Chinese companies get a lot of financial support, performance-based support from the government on their standardization activity. The arrival of Chinese standards at the international level is based on the support and stimulus from the government. So this suggests, again, our qualitative findings suggest that there is, again, an interesting difference here in how standardization is organized in China relative to these other countries. In the survey, we have two measures of state involvement. One, financial support. Does your company receive financial support from the state or government for standardization work? And then what's the importance of state support? So when your company succeeds in shaping an international standard during the formal standardization process, how important is coordination by the state? And here we specified government agencies or ministries. Here again, our hypothesis that China is probably more likely to Chinese firms are more likely to receive direct subsidies from the state was confirmed. And again, the differences are statistically significant, and the effect size is large. So 84% of the ICT firms in our sample reported receiving state financial support as compared to 35% in Germany, for example. So these are quite substantial differences that suggest that the qualitative findings that European ICT representatives in TCs have the impression that there's more support from the state for their Chinese counterparts than they themselves receive. There may be something to that. Good. And our second hypothesis here on the perception of Chinese ICT firms and ICT firms as a whole in our sample regarding the role of state support in a successful push to develop an international standard. Here, Chinese firms do see state support as key to success, but they are not so different than some other countries in the sample. So almost all firms in China, but as well as South Korea, view state coordination as important or very important in the successful push to develop an international standard. Now, this is probably not surprising because as we said at the outset of this presentation, these are two latecomer countries where the state plays a more prominent role in the development of standards. So that's kind of consistent with a different way of organizing standardization governance at the national level. Okay, and here I will turn things over to Daniel to talk about China threat perception.
Yes, hello from my side as well. As Sarah already mentioned, our survey also focused on perceptions of changing dynamics and power relations in international ICT standardization. And one core question here aimed to understand whether and to what degree China's rising influence is perceived as a threat by firms in those countries that have historically dominated international standardization. Given the fact that standardization has become, as we all know, and Sarah mentioned that as well already, a central arena in the geo-economic and geopolitical rivalry between China and the US, one of our core hypotheses here was that US respondents are most likely to perceive China as a threat. This assumption has also been building on our qualitative research on the issue, illustrated by the following two quotes. When talking to a EU standardization expert in August 2022, the person replied, "We are more happy with China taking on influence at ISO IAC than the US because the US sees that as a threat." And more recently, in March 2026, I was interviewing a ICT firm representative in Europe who argued specifically, I quote here, specifically regarding 5G, and I've experienced this myself, when there were meetings that took place in the US, our Chinese colleagues couldn't attend, and conversely, when they were held in China, the Americans couldn't attend. The reasons could have been that they didn't get their visas in times or that the companies were actually banned, referring here to restrictions on participation in standardization meetings. We have several, next slide please, we have several measures for judging the China threat perception. What we're presenting today are the results on the statement. Chinese firms increasing participation in international standard setting bodies is undermining the deliberative consensus-based practices of international standardization. There were 5 answer options ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Next slide, please. The findings here clearly support our hypothesis. They clearly and significantly show that US firms are most critical when it comes to China's increasing role in international standardization, with 69% answering that they agree or strongly agree with the statement. At the same time, it should also be mentioned that the majority of firms in other countries also agree that China is changing the rules of the game. Next slide, please. The final sets of results that we want to present today from our survey are focused on the standardization governance preference among international ICT firms. So outlooks on the future of governance in international standardization. And more specifically here, we focus now on whether and to what degree ICT firms aim to or see it necessary to contain China's rise, or whether they aim to increase cooperation with China given its increasing leverage in international standardization. Again, based on geopolitical dynamics and our previous qualitative research, our hypothesis here is that US respondents would be significantly more likely to favor containment based instead of cooperation with China, and also in contrast to European firms who are, we assume, more worried about protecting the status quo of the current international standardization architecture and thus want to integrate Chinese firms and cooperate with them more strongly. Again, here to illustrate just two quotes, a German standardization expert in November 2025 argued, if we are now pushing the Chinese away a little from consensus-based standardization, we're not doing ourselves any favor, because then they will go elsewhere. And if this leads to different national standards, we will have gained nothing. A European ICT firm representative in March 2026 said, we have to consider to what extent we coordinate our efforts to exclude China or to form a united front against it, and to what extent we provoke them into perhaps building their own infrastructure with what is now called the Global South. In the end, this weakens ISO, and I believe that this, above all, does not help the European economy. Next slide, please. Again, we had several measures for this. Sarah already referred to the US-EU Trade and Technology Council earlier. We are using, for illustration today, two items of the survey. We first asked respondents on their reply to the statement, cooperation on standardization within the US-EU Trade and Technology Council should be strengthened in order to protect international technical standardization from Chinese firms' growing influence. And we secondly asked reactions to the statement, cooperation with Chinese firms in international standardization bodies should be increased. Next slide, please. On the one hand, our hypothesis here was again confirmed insofar as 82% of US firms do favor containment. So they showed a strong or very strong agreement to the measure we used for containment here. In other words, US firms are significantly more in favor of containing and countering China's influence than firms based in other countries of our sample. Next slide, please. However, and this is where it becomes particularly interesting, I think, our survey also or equally demonstrated that US firms also show strong support for cooperation with China. Therefore, based on this particular measure, we would say that criticism of China among ICT firms and the willingness to cooperate are not mutually exclusive. And US companies appear to support a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, closer coordination with so-called like-minded countries, but at the same time, greater cooperation with China. Next slide, please. As Sarah mentioned, one of Sarah Lett's project is focused on a comparison between standardization practices and strategies of Chinese and Korean firms in our survey. We also included Korea in the sample, and we wanted to particularly ask and find out what are the standardization governance preferences among Korean firms. Here, our hypothesis, thanks for the slide. Here, our hypothesis is that there is a stronger tendency among Korean firms to contain China, given the close relationship between Korea and the US. Again, reflected in our qualitative research. A Korean SDO representative in August 2024 argued, when new TCs or SCs are established, the US has a bit of influence and we tend to follow that a little bit more. So we can't help but feel that China is being kept in check in international standardization activities these days. A Korean standards expert in June 2024 argued, in many sectors, China, Korea, Japan are competing, and it's very difficult to cope. But we still have certain forums to regularly communicate when there is a chance for cooperation. So we are trying to have a regular network. Next slide, please. The measures here are again two statements. We asked respondents or we confronted respondents with the statement the Korean state should promote the establishment of a regional East Asian standardization body that includes Japan and China. So this is here used as a statement for cooperation or for measuring cooperation in East Asia. And the second statement or the second measure used here referring to sort of a wish to contain China, was the Korean state should increase cooperation with Japan, the US, and other like-minded countries in order to counter Chinese firms' rising influence in international standardization. Next slide, please. And I would say, indeed, similarly to the US results, but we can discuss this. What we find here is that Korean firms also wish, on the one hand, containment. So 69% of Korean firms were strongly in favor of the statement for further cooperation with like-minded countries such as Japan and the US to contain China. But at the same time, there is also a significant majority among Korean firms that showed their wish or preference for cooperation within East Asia, meaning also with China and Japan. Next slide, please. Therefore, I would like to come to the key takeaways, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. So first of all, when it comes to the dimension of firm investments, we have shown, or our survey shows, that within corporate structures, standardization has a very high priority in Chinese firms. This is confirming our hypothesis, and it could clearly be seen by measures that we presented today, such as measures on standardization training and the existence of standardization departments. At the same time, Chinese firms, our survey showed, are not doing more standardization training than others. Here, our survey also showed that the US, UK, and Germany, or firms from those countries, are actually in the lead. When it comes to the state role, confirming our hypothesis that the state plays a central role in standardization in China, we showed that China is an outlier in terms of level of state support for standardization and the importance of state coordination. And finally, when it comes to the dimension of the China threat perception and various response options or ideas about the future governance of international standardization, our survey shows that US firms are, on the one hand, more critical of China, but on the other hand, also wish for closer cooperation with China. This is to an extent similar with firms in Korea. So this means that it's not an either-or story, but as we argue, might indicate a double-pronged strategy among firms in those two countries. Thank you very much for your attention, and again, looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Daniel. I think you provided a nice ground for a very interesting discussion. But before we open the discussion, I'd like to welcome Professor Lee, who is with us, right? You are now with us, but kind of under the wrong name here, with Daniel Fuchs. But you get later the word. I would now like to hand over to Su Li Zheng from China to comment from her perspective the findings of Sarah's and Daniel's work. Therefore, Su Li, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you see the slides? Okay. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to join this talk. As far as I know, this is one of the first study that multinational survey, including China. So I'd like to share some comments and thoughts from one insider's perspective. If I understand it correctly, I think we can summary the funding of this survey as the following points. First, China is becoming one of the major players in international standardization. And second, Chinese firms prioritize standardization very high, and about 97% of those firms having standardization departments. And third, China stands out as a significant outlier in the state involvement. And fourth, US firms are the most likely to perceive China as a threat to the international standardization system. And what I would like to say first is that, as Marcus Aurelius has said, everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. So basically, I think the data, I agree on a lot of data, but maybe there's a gap among the interpretation and understanding of the data. So I like to share some of the observations as a Chinese standardization scholar. And first, for the role of China in international standardization, I totally agree that China has grown to be one of the major players in the international standardization field. But behind this rise, I think there are some questions we can discuss further. The first question is, what role should developing countries play in the international standardization system? And I think we all know that for the past century, the developed economies like the US, UK, Germany all have played a very important role. And I think they have shaped the international standardization landscape. And I think this dominance have reflected the global development of that period of time, including their industrial prowess, their manufacturing capability, and also their market power. But more recently, I think more and more developing countries, especially China, have gradually built their technological background and innovation capability, especially in some key sectors like the 5G. So at the same time, these developing countries are trying to play a more active role in the international standardization system, moving from passive adopter to active contributor. As far as we know, I think the intent behind this transition is to contribute or co-build the international standards rather than dominate the rules. Although I know that there are some Chinese news sometimes like to use this phrase, but I think that is a rhetoric expression rather than the real intent. And we hope to participate in international standardization. And this participation, I think, is not a replacement of the existent, but as a supplement. Because China is one of the largest market and also the largest manufacturing hub, we have a lot of experience, and also I think those best practice we have already obtained some of this experience. So we hope to contribute all this expertise and the solutions to the international standardization work. So that involvement, we believe that will enhance the global representativeness and applicability of these standards. And when more and more emerging economies and developing countries actively participate in this system, I think the sustainability of the entire global standardization system will also be strengthened. The second issue about the firm investment in standardization. Here, maybe there's a question mark. I agree that more and more Chinese firms, they pay a lot of attention to standardization. But as far as I know, I think from our on-the-ground experience, I think the investment is far from that high. Here, I have some data. we have took a small-scale survey for firms that participated in standardization. And from that survey, we observed that about 2/3 has standardization department and 1/3 has regular trainings. But this is not random samples, but firms who have participated in standardization development. And also in Zhejiang province, where I live, Zhejiang province is one of the most advanced province in China and is one of the best, I think one of the best province doing in standardization. And we have took a survey in 2022. And in that survey, we found that about 17% of firms have standardization department. So we can see that there's a great gap between this 17 and 19.7. But I know that this survey is not targeted for ICT sector. ICT sector must be higher, but I don't think 90%. And one reason may be that I noticed that the firms in your survey from China are most large and very large firms. Yes, for Huawei and for China Mobile or ZTE, they definitely have the standardization department. But we have much more small and medium-sized firms who do not have such a department. And also for the personnel, according to the Zhejiang province survey, we found that although most firms admit that they have a person who deal with standardization, but more than 64% are part-time. So that means they may be an engineer, they may be a manager, but if necessary, they may also deal with the standardization issues. But on average, one enterprise have 1.4 person dealing with standardization. So according to our experience, I think generally speaking, the firm's investment and capability is still very far behind rather than very advanced, especially for FMEs. So I have several points. Maybe I think we can further clarify it. First one is how about the method we do the survey to sample firms? So is there specific sampling techniques or we just send out randomly? And I think who answer this question may be very large firms and doing very well in standardization. But for those firms who know very little about standardization, they do not get access to this survey. So maybe this is one of the concern about the sampling methodology. And so related is how representative about the surveyed company compared to the broader industry landscape in China. So do they stand for the majority or they are just the top tier of the hierarchy? And also, I wonder how about the cross-national comparability? Is the surveyed enterprise comparable across all these 6 countries? Or no, I don't know if we have several measures to ensure the validity of these firms and the comparison of these findings. And number 3 is about the state involvement in standardization. Yes, for China, government play a very important role in standardization, both for domestic standardization and international standardization. But there are several reasons. Maybe I can explain a little bit. The first reason is that China's historical standardization system is a government-led top-down approach. So that could explain much of the result. And the second issue maybe few people mention is that in China, those standardization research institutions are very important players and enablers in the ecosystem. But most of these institutions are also funded by the government. So these experts from these institutes, for example, China Standardization Institutes, they have a lot of experts participated in international standardization. But when they are counted, they usually count as government employer. But in fact, according to my opinion, they are just those experts working for this institute. And another reason, especially for the international standardization, since SAC represents China in ISO and IEC, and we know that all these activities have to be coordinated before to vote in ISO. But SAC is a department of the government. So that naturally that these activities is coordinated by the government. So I think there is a historical reason about the governance of standardization, and not only standardization, but maybe the governance structure in China. But I don't think that, or I don't mean that government lead is good or the more the better. In fact, we have realized that the Chinese government have realized that for standardization, we need a more diverse, more dynamic, market-driven system. So that is why during the past 10 years, there is a great reform considering the standardization system. Since we do not have time to explain every measure, but we think that we can emphasize that the group standards. Group standards is those market-driven voluntary standards, which first appear after 2015. And we make a very great improvement in this direction. As the figure shows, by the February of this year, we have more than 8,000 groups and who have published more than 125,000 group standards. So these are all voluntary standards. So I think more recently, China has standardization has reforms have been advancing steadily and gradually transition from the government lead model to the market-driven, but with the guidance of government model. And besides this reform, starting from last year, another market-driven or market-oriented reform is also taking place, although that is not happening in the international arena. So starting from last year and also this month, there's the news about the SAMR. They try to streamlining local standards. In fact, in China, there are three levels standards: national standards, industrial standards, and local standards. Local standards are standards led by local government. So from last year, the SAC is trying to overhaul a lot of these local standards, that is local government funded standards, because they think that we need a more dynamic and market-driven system. So in some regions, especially at the city level, I heard that more than half of the local standards have been overhauled. So I think that's a very good, great step toward the market lead reforms. And about the financial support, yeah, I know in China there is financial subsidy for international standards development. Especially, for example, in Beijing, Shenzhen, they give some subsidy to those firms who have developed international standardization. But from the government's perspective, I have talked with some of the officials. I think their intention, their original intention, is to encourage their innovation capability and their standardization capability. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of companies, especially SMEs, their capability is still far behind. So the government hope to guide their long-term investment in capability and innovation rather than a replacement of their own investment in standardization. And I also think put in the global context, so public support for R&D, including standardization, is also a normal national industrial policy or innovation policy, not only in China, although maybe the exact measure may be improved in the future. Number 4, about the China threat perception. I'm sad that nowadays as the geopolitical tension between the U.S. and China gets severe and severe. So I know that more and more experts and also enterprises may be seeing Chinese participation as a threat. So it's a sad fact. But I think there are something we can do, and also we can discuss further. Is number one is why participation by China was deemed as a threat if our original intent was contribution. Is there a better way to participation? Maybe we can talk further in this direction. But I think if the US see China as a threat, is that because there's a natural assumption that those standards should always lead by the US, or should the system be a dynamic change under dynamic change process? And another issue about maybe one reason is because the governance system as the government lead standardization system. But for this issue, I wonder, is one size fit all? Countries do have different governance structures, but I think that we can try to find some common ground while respecting difference in the exact governance structure. And also for developing countries such as China, as our capability grow, the engagement in standardization is both a right and a responsibility. So if your capability grow, you only adapt without contribution. That is not right, right? And for future directions, I think for this study, I like this study, but maybe there are some improvements based on the current data. First is we can enhance the representativeness of the survey samples. And another issue is that I think we have a lot of data. Maybe in the future, we can investigate the underlying mechanisms, especially the mechanism behind this capability enhancement. Maybe we can take some case studies that can explain more deeper behind this phenomena. And also, I think for the China threat perception, maybe we can examine this issue with a broader historical and temporal context. And finally, although we have differences, we have different opinions, and we are developing at different stages, I think standardization is consensus, not contact. So win-win cooperation will help each country, including China and including every other countries. The question we should ask is how can we collaborate, work together to benefit each society, each country, or the society. So thank you very much. So I look forward for your comments and happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Suli, for this very kind of detailed response, also considering all the work you have done and also the data you have available. And I would like to give both Sarah and Daniel a brief opportunity to respond to your suggestions, critique, before we move on to Professor Lee.
Okay, I will start. Thank you so much, Suli, for engaging with our work so deeply. It's very generous of you, and these are very good thoughts that you've put on the table for us. I wanted to sort of emphasize that the point that you started with pointing out that it is entirely legitimate for countries like China, South Korea, and India to be demanding a place at the table in international standardization. Daniel and I are completely on board with that. So that's in fact how we came to be fascinated by the standardization, because we have a history in studying Chinese economy and political economy, and saw that this is a domain where these latecomers have really arrived. And so on that point, we are our sort of normative starting points are not to say that we see any inherent problem with China having taken its rightful place at the table. That's sort of how we see it. And so we agree with you entirely that this is a change that needed to happen given underlying shifts in the global economy. On the question of the particular firms that we're looking at and how our findings align or don't align with the previous survey work that you've done in China, that's very, very interesting, and we should talk more about this. We should definitely pursue this further. I would say that we might here be looking at sort of apples and oranges in terms of the kinds of firms who we were interested in for the purpose of this study. Again, our interest, one of our underlying interests, is in sort of teasing out the geopolitics, the aspect of geopolitics that's now unfortunately become embedded in international standardization. And so therefore, we're looking at firms that are active in international standardization. So you mentioned at one point that we were probably looking at firms that are at the top tier of this firm hierarchy. Indeed, we are, and that's true across the cases that we're interested in. We were less successful in Korea than we were in the five other countries in that regard. So we're looking at these big players that are active in international standardization. So that might explain to some extent why our data looks different than your the survey in Zhejiang, for example, where you have presumably some larger players who are active in standardization, and then some for whom they are involved in standardization, as you said, but perhaps at the national level and not at the international level, as a hypothesis for maybe explaining why we have different findings in that regard. Daniel.
Yes, thanks also from my side, Suli. Really great comments and a lot to think about. Especially happy that you join us. I've been in Hangzhou recently in the past several years for research as well, and was at your university talking to your colleagues. So very happy to see you and hope to meet you in person soon. What can I add to what Sarah said? I think the 2 points that she made are very important. I think, again, it's critical to see that we really focused on firms that are engaged in international standardization, therefore, and on, in this presentation, on large and very large firms. So we are starting with firms that have, we're looking at firms that have employees, an employee size of more than 250, right? So this is our definition for where large firms start. And therefore, I'm not questioning the survey data that you presented in your comment, but would say that this does not, question necessarily the robustness of our data. We did some robustness checks in various regards, also relating to the firm size, but also to the specific sectors, subsectors within ICT and so forth. And it was based on these robustness checks that we presented the data. But I'm really happy to continue this conversation, and this is why we do this presentation to exchange with you. I have one other comment, or two quick comments. One thing on the normative issue. Sarah mentioned that already. Our normative starting point, I think, is not very different from what you've outlined. And I've myself written several papers on sort of the historical dominance of early industrialized countries in international standardization. So I'm completely on board with you on this historical perspective. Definitely, it was just no time to integrate this in this presentation. And another point for further discussion maybe is, however, the question on state involvement in China. I would still argue that China is a state-centered standardization system. And I think the story with association standards is slightly more complicated. I do think that this is a major reform indeed, but I do not think that it means a a lesser degree of state control and state oversight. But this is something we can discuss in the future. And I would give the word back to Knut.
Yeah, thank you both for your comments. Before we move on to Professor Lee, I would like to ask you both to look at the Q&A section. There may be one or other question you might be able to answer. From my perspective, yeah, data in standardization is really a hot and difficult topic, and we do that since years with Germany, but here we have kind of the focus on DIN, and there I think we have a good and also representative the database. And for example, here between 10 and 20% of the companies have indeed standardization department, which is also a little bit in line with what you found. Another question we were asking in the current European standardization panel, where this will be released soon, is that from the respondents, around only 20 to 30% said that they were trained in standardization. But since you focus on ICT companies, here the share is much higher. Therefore, maybe it's not as high as if you take also small companies into account, but certainly here the culture of educating and training people related to standardization is much more elaborated than other contexts. Last point, I might also refer to a study by Tom Barrett, who looked at the participation of different countries at ISO and IEC, although IEC is difficult. And his claim, and you might also look at a webinar that we did in the context of the INSA project, he claims that looking at Chinese kind of scientific and research outputs like patents and publications, China is still underrepresented in international standardization. That's his kind of hypothesis, just to show you, okay, there are very different views on how to kind of assess what we see and at the current situation. But now I'd like to hand over to Professor Lee. Welcome to our webinar, and now we move on from China to Korea, and would like to hear a little bit your views, your assessment of what Sarah and Daniel have presented. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm Hee-Jin Lee from Korea. It is my pleasure to join this interesting webinar. In fact, I was waiting on the Teams for the reason I don't know, and I don't know why Daniel Fuchs' name is shown here on my monitor. Anyhow, first of all, I appreciate Sarah and Daniel for their initiative and the efforts to conduct an international survey of this scale on standardization, which is rare to my knowledge. As Professor Zhang provided a comprehensive list of comments and discussion points, particularly from China's point of view, I will make a short list of comments and questions from a Korean perspective. Although I am a standard researcher based in Korea, my comment and opinion are my personal one, not to be interpreted as representing the Korean standard community. And the survey results consist of 4 pillars. I will go through one by one. For the investment topic 1, according to the survey result, less than half of South Korean firms have a standardization department. In fact, it occurs with my general perception on Korean firms' engagement with standardization. It may also be matched with the general opinion shared among standard experts in Korea. I do not have detailed information on the size of Korean respondent companies, but to my knowledge, big companies have a dedicated standard department and personnel with titles of something related to standard, whereas there are many that do not have such an institutional arrangement. It is often said among standard experts in Korea that they need more recognition and support from the company. And the topic 2, state involvement. State involvement is valued by firms from all countries. Firms see the state coordination as a key success factor all over 70%, Korea and China over 90s or even close to 100%. When I looked at the graph, a question occurred to me. What if the same question was asked more than a decade ago, when there was no or little geopolitical rivalry surrounding technologies, particularly critical and emerging technologies? Isn't it recently emerging shaped perception due to the US-China rivalry on technology? Or even before the rivalry, would be the perception similar? I just wonder. I'd like to ask this question to all of us, not to just Daniel and Sarah. And the number three, China perceived as a threat. Firms see China as a threat to standardization processes. No particular recognizable difference among the countries. For example, Korea 61%, Germany 56%. But there's something noticeable and interesting when combined with the topic four, which is standardization governance. That is, Koreans are least willing to, according to the survey outcomes, Koreans are least willing to cooperate with China, while regional cooperation in the East Asia is considered necessary. It needs some interpretation. My thought for the former, which means the least willing to cooperate with China, is that it is because China is now perceived as a strong rival competitor in any field of technology nowadays, including standardization. So I think there may be more a mentality of rivalry than that of cooperation. That's why they respond in that way. But for the latter, they still seek after cooperation at the regional level. It is inevitable due to the geographic proximity among the three countries. So there have been cooperation efforts among the three countries, so-called the CJK, China, Japan, Korea, for a long period of the time. Though there is a little visible outcome, to my knowledge, at the regional level. That is a kind of a destiny of the three countries. They all say that we need cooperation in this field among us, but little actual outcome, particularly due to the rivalry. Then finally, I have a couple of comments and overall comments and question. First, it would be great if Japan is included in the survey. Japan is traditionally and currently a major player in international standardization. If Japanese experts' view is included, the research will be able to provide a more comprehensive picture on the subject dealt with by the research project. And then another the question, what is the unit of analysis, in fact? Is it an individual respondent or is it a firm? The subject of all the sentences in the presentations is firms, not respondents. So I'd like to ask, how do you guarantee that they represent their company's view, not their own? What measures were taken for this purpose? So that is the question I wondered while reading the presentation and listening to your presentation. Thank you very much. That's it for at the moment.
Thank you, Professor Lee. I don't know, Sarah, Daniel, you want to respond to his comments or suggestions?
Daniel, you want to take the lead here?
I can start, yes. Thanks again, Heejin, for cooperation. I think for the sake of transparency, we should mention that Heejin we're closely cooperating with Heejin. He has been extremely valuable as a cooperation partner. Without him, we would not have been able to do our fieldwork in South Korea, in fact. So thanks for that again on this occasion, Heejin, and thanks for your comments. What should I focus on? I think that the first comment that you made about in your view, relatively high degree of Korean firms that have a standardization department with 49%, I think really comes down again to what we discussed earlier with regards to China, that the focus is on large and very large companies that are active also in international standardization. I think if you would have included SMEs, and I also, know that through fieldwork in China, the view would be very different. So CUTS, the Korean equivalent to the SAC in China, they are also trying very hard to encourage SMEs, to support SMEs in investing in further in standardization, but see challenges there. So I agree that if we would look at the entire landscape of firms, then the picture might be different. But again, here the focus is on large and very large firms in ICT, and I think this is how the survey results can be explained. With regards to state involvement, your second comment, this is a very good point. I think, as you said, this is something that we should discuss amongst all of us, right? So does the increasing geopolitical dimension of standardization, does this lead to different perspectives on whether or not firms want state involvement, right? I think that's very different. In my interviews with European firms, I think you can also see this difficult relationship, right? On the one hand, yes, political oversight among some respondents is wanted, but on the other hand, there's a reluctance to have sort of the state controlling where the game goes. But that again, that's based on the qualitative side of research here. On the CJK, so China, Korea, Japan cooperation, I think you outlined that there's nothing else to comment on it. I would just do some self-advertisement by saying that Sarah and I published a paper in China Information, I think 1 or 2 years ago, where we also focused or have a section on particularly this history of regional cooperation in East Asia. The unit of analysis here, we measured that by including a specific item in the survey that let respondents choose whether or not they are responding as an individual or from the perspective of the company. So we are also do sort of our data quality checks and robustness checks were based also on the responses to this item, so that we don't mix things up here. And my last comment is to one question that was put online by Simon Dix, I think it was. How do you arrive at such low activity in ICT standards in South Korea? This is, I think, a misunderstanding. So the slide that we presented on participation in ISO and IEC is for illustration to show which countries are very active in ISO and IEC, but our survey also included companies, of course, that were active in 3GPP, IEEE, and ITU. So we have a large section of our survey actually asking companies specifically to provide information on how active they are in those different institutions. So we include them there.
May I
Sarah?
add to that point? So yeah, the first question by Simon from the DSIT, what Sarah meant to say was, as far as I understand, many of the Korean experts come from universities and state-funded R&D institute. The participants from companies, particularly when it comes to ISO and IEC, according to one of my findings while I was writing for the World Bank report, less than 10% of Korean chairs and experts in ISO IEC come from the universities and state-funded R&D institute. Of course, ITU or 3GPP, there are some different, but that's what the Sarah meant to say when she said that low percentage or profile.
Okay. Any other comments?
I would maybe thank you, Heejin, for these great and thoughtful comments as always, and also for correcting my misstatement there. I am following the questions in the chat here very carefully. Thank you so much for putting these great questions on the table. I feel like we're constrained a little bit by the format of the webinar here, because I would love to hear more from people who are clearly very knowledgeable about this topic here in the chat. Suzanne Lutka, we will see each other at our Tectonics kickoff event in June. She's giving the keynote speech there, and she raised the question that one of our key takeaways based on the data presented by Daniel towards the end of the presentation, that we're not talking about, when it comes to the perspectives of US ICT firms in the sample, not talking about an either or story, but containment plus cooperation. And how do we interpret that? We were very also intrigued by this finding and are still sort of working it through, and also trying to get answers to this question through our qualitative analysis. Intuitively, I think this has to do with a question raised by someone in the chat earlier about the possibilities of fragmentation in, particularly now everyone's talking about AI standardization, and if that happens, right, there are all kinds of negative consequences for interoperability, right, that we have these sort of emerging regional tech worlds, which would be bad for certainly big tech. So I think that might help to explain it, right? That on the one hand, these big players in ICT are interested in keeping on the same page, as it were, but are also very interested and concerned about making sure that their own voices have the same amplitude as they did, maybe before the days that China arrived at the table. So I think that's one way to see it. And what we have heard in interviews is that when, for example, European ICT firm representatives talk about, in sort of jealous tones, about the support that Chinese firms are getting from the state, these subsidies and stuff, that they're saying, often the follow-on is, well, and we would like to see the German government paying more attention to this issue and giving us some money to attend all of these meetings. So that might be a little thought there.
Okay. Did we answer all questions? Just regarding the support, good stand ICT is an instrument, yeah, for supporting European experts in contributing to international standardization. And if you are interested to get some funding, there are open calls, and I think currently there's still one open where you can apply to get some funding. Good, Germany has a bigger program, which future will be discussed, I think. Next week I will be in the ministry to hear what their plans are. Another point which I wanted to make was reflecting the suggestion, maybe we should change the system. As I said before, some authors still do not see that China, at least at the ISO level, I think in the ICT world, it's a little bit a different story, especially if you're also looking at hard indicators like standardization patents, where at least in some domains, China is very dominant, name Huawei and others. But if we look at ISO, what we see on the one hand is the increasing share of secretaries and chairmanships by China. But again, and here I'm with Tom Barrett, if you compare that with the scientific publications and the patents, it's still an underrepresentation. And I can share a link to an article where we try to assess kind of what's in a standard, where does it come from, the content, and we look at the scientific publications referenced in ISO standards, and here we still see an overrepresentation of US, Germany, UK. Yeah, that means China is not there. It's changing with another who also we looked at the new work items. Here, China is proposing a lot of new stuff to ISO, and we will get a kind of maybe a new balance. Therefore, I'm not sure whether we are going to have to change the rules. I don't know whether there's an ISO representative with us, and maybe Reinhard Weisinger, as the expert in the field, might have a view on this, whether he sees that. But if you have an idea of whether this is needed, I don't see it yet. But I'm really not into the ISO world. In the ICT world, it's a little bit different one. Somebody raised the hand, and who is this? Therefore, Chen. Luigi, can the person kind of speak? Has the right to speak?
Yes.
Good news to my questions. Which questions were this? Did we? Oh, Chen, which question was this?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this.
Okay, then go ahead.
Yeah, so the questions are from someone in, I think, Daniel and my area of political science that may not be of foremost interest to others here in the webinar. So I will try to keep this answer brief. And the question is about can one formulate a typology of state involvement in standardization? And that's a good question, something that we're working on in our team. I would say that one role of the state is in sort of goal orientation, the goal formulation. So we've seen, of course, China's national standardization strategies play a really important function in sort of orienting both subnational governments as well as officials, as well as firms towards what are the priority sectors, for example, in standardization. And interestingly, these national standardization strategies, Daniel and I have a paper on this. There seems to be some sort of cross-national diffusion. So suddenly, many countries have now national standardization strategies, and this seems to be a kind of response to what's happened in China. So that's quite interesting. So goal orientation is one. Financial support is another. We've talked about that at some length. And then coordination. And this speaker or this questioner will certainly be familiar with the varieties of capitalism literature. And here I think that's really relevant for thinking about the role of the state. So the extent to which the state itself can internally coordinate. So for example, in the Chinese case, we see that the Standardization Administration of China is a really big government player in sort of goal orientation and that sort of thing. But we also have the MIIT, for example, and these two ministries sometimes compete with each other over sort of control of standardization policy. So that's one important dimension. To what extent can the state speak with one voice? That's in the Chinese case certainly relevant. And then to what extent can the state effectively coordinate with firms, get firms to follow its goals, for example? That's another part of the dimension. And yeah, I think that looking into the varieties of capitalism approach has some interesting insights there. Thank you for the question.
Good. Now, all question answered. I think there was Susan. Yeah, good strategy for latecomers. That was the second question. What is the most realistic pathway? Any views on that? I know studies which show that then especially China joined forces with other established player in the field in order to get on board, and also in order to get their items supported and their content into standard. That was a strategy maybe a little bit before the current area of these geopolitical tensions. Therefore, these studies, if I remember right, reflect a little bit the time between 2000 and 2010, 15. Therefore, I've no idea how this has been changing and whether this kind of cooperative attitude has changed. And we see also from your results there is this ambivalence. And since we have nobody from the US here, I can report something from the US Embassy visit I had here to Berlin. And here the embassy has done some analysis of who is collaborating in research with China, and the figures show that in the last few years, the cooperation of US researchers with China stagnated. And that was their critical comment to me, maybe as one representative of the German research system. But you guys, you still kind of increase your collaboration and co-publication activities with China, and at least from the government perspective, they were not so amused about that. That's the position, not only from the embassy but also from the current administration. And this position was also quite openly discussed with our students. That means that's not really a hidden critique they have, especially related to how Germany is still quite closely collaborating with China. Therefore, this is an interesting position. And maybe next time I have to invite somebody from the US to your talk, but I wanted to focus here on Asia. There will be follow-up activities. I can already announce because we are going to publish the second edition of the European Standardization Panel, which is not addressing all your political or geopolitical topics, but the issue of capacity, education, etc., will be also be tackled, and therefore this might be then one follow-up. And the other follow-up is that the Indian Standards Institute has kind of copied our approach, and there will be also an output from India. Maybe we do a European-Indian comparison in the next edition of this webinar, but this will take place after the summer break, not before. These are the two topics. The European ones will be published definitely probably in September. There will be some opening, and then we have to discuss with my Indian partner how we are going to release what their results, following kind of one by one the European Standardization Panel, which has a strong focus on the interface between research and standardization, therefore a little bit slightly different perspective. That's a little bit the look, the way forward. Since we are now getting to the end, thanks a lot. Thanks for your great presentations, the interesting discussions, which were quite lively, and I like this, and especially the interaction between the four of you, plus my interventions, plus then also the questions from the audience, and therefore I'm happy to kind of we do that since you also announced there will be some update activities, and we will bilateral talk certainly about this in 2 weeks' time, which I'm looking forward to. In this context, I wish everybody, nice evening already. Back to our Asian guests, and also already us a nice Friday and a relaxing weekend, and nice but maybe not too hot summer. Thanks.